Gracias por invitarme. Estoy encantada de estar aquí. And now I'm going to speak in English. I've practiced. And thank you very much, gentlemen, for all the lovely things you've said. I want to start with what I think might be a surprise, because I want to show you my favourite work in the wider collection of the Prado. Oops, sorry. There, oh, it was up there already. And it's this, right? It's not on display. You may not be too surprised to know that. But it's in store at the Museum of... this is a really difficult one for me. Jaén, right? Forgive me, that's the worst word I've got. It was painted in the late 19th century by Arturo Montero y Calvo, and it depicts a scene that would have been familiar to anyone steeped in the history of ancient Roman emperors. For this is the dead body of Agrippina, the mother of the emperor, I say Nero, but Nero. And this here must be Nero himself inspecting it. Now, the background here is important. Agrippina had helped ease Nero, still then a teenager, onto the throne in 54 AD, ahead of at least one better qualified candidate. And her influence over him was said to be so strong that it was assumed, and we have no idea if this was true, that they were having an incestuous affair. According to the standard Roman story, the young man soon tired of his mother and decided to get rid of her. And his first attempt at this was a ridiculous failure. He put her to sea in a collapsible boat designed to break apart so it would look as if she drowned simply in an accident. He did this, but what the silly boy had forgotten was that his mum could swim, so she made it to dry land, and Nero had to choose rather more conventional methods to get rid of her. He sent round a hit squad. That is a rather lurid version of the attempt at the collapsible boat. What we see in this painting, though, my Prado favourite, is the sequel to that, the sequel to the murder. But it's also a clever commentary on it. Nero, as I pointed him out on the far side here, is inspecting the dead body, just as ancient writers said he did. But the painter has laid her out on a leopard skin, hinting, I think, at the sexuality of their relationship. Her breasts are on display, to put it mildly, and Nero's hand over here shows that he is about, anxiously, to expose the rest of her body. The other men offer a glimpse of how the courtiers are responding to this episode. The guy at the end of the couch does look a bit uncomfortable, I think. But the other three are intently peering at Agrippina as if she were a scientific specimen, with no sign of any emotion apart from curiosity. To be a successful Roman courtier, the painter is suggesting, you almost have to lose your human feelings entirely. You have to treat the dead body of the emperor's mother as if it was just a specimen. I think, then, this is a more subtle image than it looks at first sight, which is why it's one of my favourites, and it raises issues that I'm going to come back to. My interest this evening is not so much in how ancient Romans represented their emperors, though I'll there will be a bit of that, but how later ages have represented Roman emperors. We are surrounded even now by images of Roman men of power in huge numbers. I reckon that in the West, before what we might call the age of mechanical reproduction, there were more images of Roman emperors than of any other human beings at all, apart from Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, and possibly a few other saints. And my question is really, what are these images doing? Are they more complicated than they seem? What are we missing if, as most of us do, me included, we simply walk past lineups of modern busts of ancient Roman emperors without really stopping to look at them? Can we still see these emperors as something more than a joke? They certainly are that, as these cartoons from all over the world show. They're all different versions of the famous story of Nero again playing his lyre while Rome goes up in flames in 64 CE, a scene which is still often, very often, reproduced to satirize a politician whose mind is not on the job, whether that's Bashar al-Assad, George W. Bush, Gordon Brown, or Silvio Berlusconi. I couldn't resist, however, putting this guy in, who's not being satirized as a politician. He is an advert for gentlemen's underwear in the 1950s, also taking a Neronian guise. But leaving the cartoons aside, Nero for centuries in the modern world has been used by painters and illustrators to debate corruption, power, and how power is handed on. In the Middle Ages, there was a particularly unpleasant variant on the painting that I started with. Now, I warn you, the image I'm going to show is not very nice, so you might want to look away until I tell you you can look back. Because in this medieval version, the emperor is depicted, and there he is in very nice medieval costume. The emperor is depicted not just gazing at the body of his mother, not just gazing at it, but actually having her cut open. This goes far beyond any ancient accounts of the incident. It was said by Roman historians that when the hit squad came for Agrippina, she asked them to strike her womb. And they also say that after she'd been killed, and this goes back to the earlier painting, Nero did gaze at the body with a glass of wine in his hand. But here, Nero is having her cut open to find her womb, to discover where he came from. I'm putting the next slide on now, so you can look back if you've looked away. First, we might think of that horrible scene of dissection, and it's one of dozens of medieval versions of that theme, absolutely dozens. We might think of it as if it was merely an example of, medieval fondness for blood, guts, and spectacle. But it is actually exploring, in a medieval way, the very idea of how power is transmitted and the role of a woman's body in that process, raising the question, which lies at the heart of many systems of monarchy, of how women make rulers. How do women make emperors? And it relates, I think, to an even stranger medieval story about Nero, which is illustrated on this slide. Because in some versions of the tale of dissection, the next thing that happens is that Nero asks the doctors who've been dissecting his mother to make him himself pregnant. The doctors realize this is impossible. So they feed Nero a potion which has a tiny little frog in it. the frog grows in the emperor's stomach until it is so painful that he vomits it up. Here on the left you see Nero in some discomfort. Nothing like childbirth, one might say, if one was a woman, but never mind. When he's vomited it up, he's devastated to discover that all he's produced is a frog. The doctors realise they have to defend themselves, so they blame him. And they say, well, it's your fault because you didn't go the full 9 months, and that's why you've got a frog. But they decide to keep the frog, and they've got him there all safe on the right, little frog, until Nero's own death, when, poor thing, they burn it. Now, again, here, what looks like a nasty, medieval, perhaps trivial fantasy is also, I think, a very pointed fantasy about the transmission of power, or perhaps more, it's a moral tale about how an emperor cannot by himself create an heir. You know, Nero is shown up at only being able to sick up a frog that the doctors had given him. Now, there are many more examples throughout modern history from the medieval period onwards where the figure of Nero is used to expose the emptiness at the heart of imperial rule and the fragility of power then and now. Now, I have to say, another one of my favourites is this 19th century painting by J.W. Waterhouse, somehow revealing Nero after his mother's murder as little more than a moody teenager lying on his bed and wondering what he's done. And of course, part of Waterhouse's point, I think, was to say, that's exactly what Nero was. This Roman emperor was a moody teenager, or only just past it. He was in his very early 20s when he had her killed. But I think a particularly sharp version, and not very well known version, is this huge, literally huge, it's meters across, this huge painting of the death of Nero himself. Now, despite its size, these kind of paintings, and this one in particular, I can assure you, are very easy to walk past, and people do walk past it in the Russian Museum. But it is actually worth a good deal of attention. It's saying quite a lot. Nero, if we fast forward a bit from the murder of his mother, was overthrown in 68 AD by legions rising up in the provinces under rival commanders. And his biographer, Suetonius, writing a few decades later, describes the emperor's last hours. These start in the palace, where actually what's a brilliantly observed passage of Suetonius, he gives us a picture of Nero's power slipping away. The key sign of his loss of authority was that when he called out to his slaves and servants, no one answered him, no one came running. Now, I don't know how many of you have read in detail about the final days of Donald Trump in the White House. But something very similar actually happened there. It was said that the staff simply didn't come to work. You know, the president had nobody to command. And I think both those comments on the end of Trump and Suetonius on the end of Nero shows us really how dependent power is on being able simply to get people to bring you your newspaper or clean your shoes or help you get your toga on. It comes down to those domestic details. When Nero was as it were, abandoned in the palace, he moves to one of his out-of-town properties, where he was eventually helped to kill himself. The fact that he could not kill himself on his own is always treated as a terrible sign of weakness. And he was then taken off for burial by a group of his faithful female attenders. Again, a sign of weakness that he had no men left, really. And that, of course, is what you see here. And it's the work of a 19th century Russian artist, Vasily Smirnov. And it depicts the very bare house in which the emperor actually ultimately died, and the party of women about to take him off for burial, not unlike those who are depicted burying Jesus. There is just one piece of decoration in the corner over here. It's a famous Hellenistic sculpture, originally of the 3rd or 2nd centuries BC, but many ancient versions of it survive, and I've given you one underneath here from the Louvre. It's generally known as The Boy and the Goose, and it's a much debated piece now. Is it, as I think I'm always tempted to think, just really pure, awful, horrible, bad taste kitsch? Or is it making a more elegant point? Is it a rather upmarket ornament? People debate that question. Does it depict myth, or does it depict real life? And most important, I guess, what is the intention of the nasty fat toddler who has got his arm round the goose, right? Is he having a bit of innocent fun, or is he trying to kill the poor bird, right? And what is he doing here in the painting? Well, one reason for his presence in the painting is that we do know that Nero himself owned a version of this sculpture, so it's archaeologically accurate. But there's something more to it, I think. Surely this sculpture, put so as the only piece of art in this picture, is offering a commentary on the Emperor Nero himself, about whom we have to ask some of those same questions. How culpable was Nero? How far were Nero's excesses innocent fun, or were they juvenile sadism? To put it more broadly, were all tyrannical autocrats just a version of children? Or, as I know any parent in the room will instantly recognize, are all children really tyrants? Now, in a way, the sculpture crystallizes the dilemma of the picture and the dilemma about autocratic power as a whole. It's asking us to read those questions about the sculpture into the role of the emperor himself. There is, however, a twist in the story, because another question is, who bought this painting that Smirnov had spent such a long time of? The answer to that is that it was instantly snapped up by Tsar Alexander III. Now, that might seem at first sight an odd choice for a monarch, right? The death of the death of a king, that's a really great thing for your monarchical sitting room, isn't it? But maybe, even for a king, one of the functions of these many images of Roman emperors was to prompt them to reflect on the problems and dilemmas and the corruption of one-man rule, not merely to provide a symbol to support that rule. And I'm going to find some even clearer examples of that kind of ambivalence in some of the works of art I'm going on to look at. The fact is, though, before we get to those, that tracking down Roman emperors in modern art takes you into all kinds of different places. It reveals all kinds of surprises and curiosities. Yes, Some of the busts that now line gallery walls were made to celebrate imperial power and to offer models for the modern king or dynasts. We've already seen this nice lineup from the collections at the Prado, and there are plenty more. The same goes for painting too. On the screen here are a couple of the Roman scenes commissioned in the 17th century for the Buen Retiro Palace. You're looking at the emperor presiding over a sacrifice and at a spectacular funeral of a Roman emperor. I think even here a bit of ambivalence creeps in. The gladiatorial combat at the funeral was always, I think, a slightly uncomfortable element. It was archaeologically accurate, maybe, but it raised questions, I think, about quite how far the Romans acted as a good model for how modern monarchs should do things. But there were also all kinds of variations. Roman emperors played different parts in, for example, the visual story of Christianity. Whether, as Nero again, here, Nero again, appearing in some medieval stained glass at the cathedral at Poitiers, with a little blue devil on his back. Do you see the little blue devil? He's got his crown. Underneath it says Nero Imperator, Nero the Emperor, and the devil's here, and he is watching, of course, the crucifixion of St. Peter. Or, if you wanted a rather more positive version of Roman imperial power and Christianity, you could go to this another huge canvas by Jerome, which brings together the Emperor Augustus up here and the Nativity down here, as if to say it was possible to align the story of Christianity with Roman pagan power. In other cases, images of Roman emperors and their families were adapted to critique, in not quite the satiric way that I've shown you in the cartoons, modern political figures. Here is Canaver's early 19th century portrait of Napoleon's mother, Letizia Bonaparte, Madame Mère, which he based very closely on a statue, an ancient statue, then believed, although we think rather differently now, then believed to represent the Roman Empress Agrippina, who so far we've only seen as a dead body. You can see instantly that what Canaver has done. Now, some critics accused Canaver as simple plagiarism. He just copied it. This was not creative imitation. This was cheating. But others, I think, saw rightly that there was a bigger point, or at least bigger questions being raised. The question was, what was it saying about Madame Mère, Letizia, to base her portrait on a Roman empress who was said to have murdered her husband, the Emperor Claudius, had an affair with her son, the Emperor Nero, and then been killed by him? And pushing it a bit further, what did it say about Napoleon himself that his mother was represented in the guise of the mother of Nero? Was Napoleon uncomfortably close to a Nero? Was one of the big questions, I think, at issues. And in other cases, things I think are more complicated and more debatable, we still disagree about what exactly the image of the ancient emperor Nero, again, is doing within this modern painting, 15th century portrait by Hans Memling of a man, and we don't know who he was, holding a particularly fine coin of Nero. Now, scientific analysis has shown that that coin is a late addition to the picture, but it is a very emphatic presence. What on earth is it doing? Why is it there? Why display the image of a well-known imperial monster so prominently, however elegant it might be? There have been all kinds of different suggestions for answers to that. Perhaps some people say there's a pun involved. Maybe the sitter, whose identity we don't know, was a man called Nerione, a not uncommon Italian name at the time, which the coin might therefore be signalling. Or maybe the sitter was a great collector, and this coin was merely one of his prize artistic pieces. Never mind Nero's reputation. Or maybe there is a moral in this. Maybe Memling is actually asking us to reflect on the gap between appearance and moral worth. You know? He looks like a decent man. Nero looked like a decent man. How do you know? But whatever the answer to that conundrum, Nero's presence in this picture is absolutely unavoidable. And I suppose what I'm wanting to do is to say, you know, in this talk, if we miss these images, if we miss these references to ancient emperors, we miss quite a lot about what the art is trying to talk to us about. So, in the rest of this lecture, I want to follow up some of those themes of ambivalence, uncertainty, subversion, in one particular set of paintings with a very special, though rather sad, connection with Madrid. That is, I'm going to call him Titian, Tiziano I'm talking about, but I will call him very English Titian. That is Titian's group of the first 11 Roman emperors, from Julius Caesar to the Emperor Titus, who I'm reminding you of here. Portraits, very famous portraits, that were destroyed here in the Alcázar fire in 1734. Before that, they had been the most famous modern images of Roman emperors that there had ever been. And they had formed the way people imagined Roman power in their heads. It's a version which we will come back to, but that's to give you some clue of the sort of images I'm talking about. Between being painted in the early 16th century and being destroyed in the early 18th, they travelled across Europe from the ownership of one aristocrat to another. It's a very, very kind of Euro story, this, and I partly chose it because it's a sort of anti-Brexit story, you might say. And it's also not only connected with the super-rich. Titian's original paintings were copied and recopied in their thousands, in other paintings, in prints, as you see on the screen here, and as we shall see, even more widely and surprisingly. These paintings, in their copied form, became the mass-produced success story of early modern, late Renaissance and early modern art. And of course, it's because of all those copies that we still know, despite the destruction of the originals, roughly what these paintings looked like. But I'm going to start with the lost paintings themselves before I get on to the copies. These were commissioned in the 1530s by Federico Gonzaga, the first Duke of Mantua, to decorate one of a new suite of display rooms in his ducal palace, which was being overall designed by Giulio Romano. Now, artists both then and now are often quite hard to get to actually produce the work, and the paintings were quite hard to get out of Titian. And Federico, there's plenty of vivid correspondence surviving where Federico has to use a kind of combination of bribes, threats, and a personal pension plan to get Titian actually to produce these portraits for Federico's special room. Once he'd done so, they were almost instantly a huge hit and a big visitor attraction in Mantua. One observer said, "They are more like real emperors than like paintings." And even the prints and the not brilliant painted copies that survive, as some of them here, give you some sense of the excitement that these paintings generated. Because unlike so many portraits of Roman emperors, these aren't, fixed and staid figures just looking blankly in front of them, like so many often seem to be. These portraits were animated, they were looking at each other, or they were turning away from people they didn't like in the room. And they mixed antiquarian accuracy with a kind of very in-your-face modernity. Now, Claudius is on the left here, and you can't see in this painted reproduction, you can't see this very clearly, but he's actually wearing, his face is taken from a Roman coin, and he is wearing a piece of 16th century armour, which still actually survives in the Bargello Museum in Florence. So the paintings, Titian's 11 Caesars, really dominated the room, and they dominated people's consciousness of it, but they were actually only one part of something much, much more extravagant. Now, if you go to Mantua now, the room of the emperors, as it's called, doesn't look very good, I have to say. It has been more or less dismantled, it's been stripped of the art, or much of the art, and in the early 20th century, some not terribly great, frankly second-rate copies of Titian's figures were reinstalled. And this does almost nothing to capture the impact of the original 16th century installation, which was actually total immersion in imperial power and succession. You walk right into a Roman world. We can reconstruct it a little bit better than this from some of the elements of it that still do survive, although they're now scattered across the world, and sketches done after it was completed. And this is a computerized reconstruction, but I think it gives you some idea of the kind of whole ensemble. There are the pictures of the emperors. You can see there's Nero, there's Claudius, there's Caligula. But you can see that underneath and all around, there's more and more images, which is almost entirely imperial images. You get scenes like here, and in the sketches here. You get scenes from the lives of the emperors concerned. You get horsemen like here and here, and here, which were originally identified, seen as other emperors again, more emperors. And there are all kinds, and I'll show you some examples in a minute, little roundels that represent relatives of the emperors. They represent the emperor's mums and dads and sisters whatsoever. And just to see that in a little bit more close-up, that's one of the surviving scenes from the room, which shows a scene from the life of Claudius, and it went under the picture of Claudius. There's one of the horsemen. And here, in a drawing, you can see these little coin-like roundels which show you the emperor's relatives too. People often talk about it as the room of the 11 emperors. On my counting, if you include other members of the imperial family, there were more than 70 imperial images in this room. It was absolutely overpowering and in your face. And in a sense, no wonder it became really the most famous room in Europe, actually, although it's now a pale shadow. Now, you'll have spotted, and I alerted you to this, that I've been referring to Titian's 11 emperors, when, of course, the standard number is always 12, following the number of Suetonius's biographies of the first 12 emperors, from Julius Caesar to Domitian. Didn't take long before other artists had rather missed there being a final emperor Domitian, and so even though there wasn't any space in the room, they'd completed the set. Here's just two, but you can get about a dozen attempts to add the final emperor to Titian's set. And all of the main sets of copies that we come to rely on always made the number up to 12, because that's what emperors came in. You know, emperors come in 12s, and they included a Domitian to finish it off. But it does remain a question, it has remained a question, about why did Titian only do 11? Right? Now, one answer has been that he omitted Domitian in a room that was intended to honour the Dukes of Mantua, because Domitian was a very nasty piece of work, a particularly unpleasant character, and you didn't want him there in a kind of dynastic room. That is true, but I don't see that Domitian was any nastier than either Caligula or Nero. Another common idea is that 11 emperors simply wouldn't fit into the room. And that's certainly also true in the way that the room is now arranged. But it seems to me blindingly obvious that if Titian and Giulio Romano had wanted to fit in all 12, they'd have managed it somehow. You know, they're skilled artists. They don't suddenly say, oh, whoops, I don't think we can get the 12th in. Stop at 11, mate, you know. They only wanted 11. Much more likely, I think, is that we're seeing a point about succession here. We're seeing a dynasty that doesn't finish. We don't have the last guy because this dynasty is open-ended, it's not yet finished, and it fits with the stress on the transmission of power in the rest of the decoration of the room, including the little roundels that show the portraits of the mums and dads of the emperor. What Titian is doing is celebrating the continuation of dynastic power, not dynastic power on its own. But whatever the reason for that 11, and pretty soon people forgot it was 11 and they called them 12 even though there were only 11, whatever the reason, as I said, for a time, that little room in Mantua, and it's pretty small, was one of the most famous rooms, if not the most famous room in the Western world, but only for a time. Because Federico, who'd commissioned it, died in 1540, less than a year after he'd paid Titian's final bill. And only 90 years later, inventories of the palace show that the room had already started to be dismantled. Some of its paintings had been relocated, we don't know the reason why, in other parts of the ducal palace. But soon, anyway, in 1628, most of its decoration was actually on board ship bound for Northern Europe, because the Gonzaga family was going through hard times, and agents of this particularly nasty man, Charles I of England, were in Mantua trying to buy up as many of the art treasures from the Mantuan royal dynastic collection to add to the royal collections in London. And those included the 11 Titians, plus a Domitian to make up the set, as well as some of the other paintings that had originally decorated the room. That is often treated as a terrible artistic tragedy, and in a way it is. But in truth, as I've said, the room was already being dismantled, and just a couple of years later, war in Mantua would very likely have destroyed them anyway. It wasn't, though, a glorious rescue. The English negotiations with the Gonzaga were treacherous, underhand. And the transportation of these paintings to England was terrible. A consignment of chemicals, largely mercury, was packed completely stupidly right next to the Titians, and during a storm en route, the mercury spilled over the paintings, damaging some of them beyond recognition. Right? They're only less than 100 years old, been packed up in Charles I's ships, and they put the mercury next to them, and they're pretty well gone. When the paintings reached London, there was a degree of embarrassment. And some homemade remedies were applied to the paintings, constituting actually just a mixture of milk, spit, and alcohol, was said to be brilliant, which claimed to restore them to their previous condition, but not all of them. And it's clear that at least one of the emperors, Vitellius, was in such a bad state that the King's Court painter, Anthony van Dyck, whose work you see here representing Charles, had to do a complete replacement. And he had seriously to repaint another one as well. So by this stage, what had generally been known as Titian's 12 Caesars included the Domitian that had been added by someone else in Mantua, and 2 that were wholly or largely by Van Dyck, and 9 Titians. It's also the case that that whole idea of an imperial ensemble was lost. Some of the emperors and some of the horsemen were shown together in one of Charles's picture galleries, but others were scattered around the royal properties, and the really badly damaged one was put away in a back corridor well out of sight. But this didn't last long either, because within a decade, Charles was engaged in civil war, and in 1649, only 20 years after the haul from Mantua had arrived, Charles was executed. And that's where the Spanish connection comes in. The new Republican regime in England was keen to sell off most of Charles's art collection. It was a convenient blow against the trappings of monarchy, combined with a very good way of raising some cash, which they needed. And that is how some of the elements from the original room in Mantua ended up in other collections in the UK and abroad. But in this kind of race to buy up the royal collection, the big spender was always thought to be Philip IV, with different ones of different agents of his trying to acquire different parts of Charles's collection cheaply, and certainly not wanting to let on that Felipe was the client in case it pushed the price up quickly. One of the prizes in the sale, because of their pedigree and the artist, was the set of Titian's emperors. But it is clear from the descriptions at the time that they had actually passed their best. It wasn't simply, I suspect, because he was trying to get a bargain, that one Spanish negotiator said that 6 of them were in a very poor state, and that Vitellius was not by Titian at all, and he might have added, nor was Domitian. And in the end, they were sold to Philip's agent for half the asking price. Felipe did get a bargain. We do not know what remedial treatment they received in Madrid when they arrived here, but they were hung so high in a first-floor gallery, perhaps because they didn't look all that great, frankly, that they could not be saved when the Alcázar palace, not far from here, burned down in 1734. Now, there are all kinds of important aspects to that story that I'm struck by. I'm struck, for example, by the changing meanings of these famous images. They start out in Mantua as part of a complicated ensemble parading imperial power and succession. They end up as just portraits hung here in Madrid in what was called a portrait gallery. And I'm also struck by the mobility of the pictures. It's been said that the men who rule the world get to own the Titians. And in a way, these emperors are a good illustration of that, going from the Dukes of Mantua to the King of England to the King of Spain. Oh, I've forgotten about, there he is. Sorry, we forgot about Felipe IV. But these originals and their sad fate, and I think not just in the fire, but also in the Mercury disaster, are only one part, as I've suggested, of the story. And equally important are the thousands and thousands of copies I mentioned, which not only add to our understanding of these paintings, because we don't any longer have the originals. But they give them, the copying process itself, the flooding of the world with these images of emperors, gives them a special importance. Now, these Titians started being copied in the 1560s, with leading painters sometimes copying the set and including an extra demission to complete it, sometimes doing it several times over. These are some of the ones we've already seen. The very first version was produced in the room of the empress itself by an Italian painter, Bernardino Campi, who went on to make at least 3 sets of copies for prominent figures in the Spanish court. And then in the 1570s, the then Duke of Mantua presented to another Spanish courtier, Antonio Perez, another set, which had been painted locally. You've got to imagine that Spain was pretty full of these emperors by the end of the 16th century. Because it's also pretty clear that when the original Titians arrived at the Spanish palace, the Spanish royal family already had their own set of copies of them, which were probably in better condition than what they'd got. And across Europe, there were dozens more, including a set owned by Emperor Rudolf II in Prague. And these were to have even more far-reaching impact across the West, for they were used in the 1620s, just as the originals were being shipped off to England, by Rudolf's court printmaker, Aegidius Sadler, to make a print version of Titian's 11 emperors plus Domitian. And this set of emperors literally got everywhere. It was the blockbuster sales success of 17th and 18th century printmaking. And it circulates and is copied and recopied and reprinted long after Titian's original paintings had been lost in the fire in sometimes surprising ways. And yeah, I'm putting them on the screen here for you to look at them with the added Domitian at the end. I promise you, once you get your eye in and once you look at these, you will find them absolutely everywhere in some form or other. I'm kind of almost tempted to say, you know, if you don't find one of these emperors in any major art gallery copied from this set, you know, I will buy my book back off you, you know. Okay? They're hardly recognised now, but they were once, you know, the best-known faces of modern Europe. And in case you think that I've forgotten I'm a feminist, Sadler did also do, though we don't know what his model was, 12 nice Roman empresses to match the 12 emperors. Here's just 2 of them. Now, the multiple editions of the prints are only part of it, because those prints were recopied into other forms. And there are various ways we can see that from significant details that what is being copied is not the original paintings, but it's the print. Just to give you an idea, here's a very charming set of enamels made in the 17th century, but based on Sadler's prints of the emperors, then used as a book binding in around 1800 to bind a copy of Suetonius's Caesars. We've got, here's a little cheap 19th century plaque, which actually reproduces in metal Sadler's Caligula. I know it's cheap because I bought it in an auction for £5 outside Cambridge, unrecognised by anybody. Here is a rather kind of gloomy lead sculpture of Otho, which must be taken from Sadler's Otho. The face is a bit difficult to see, but just look at the details of the clothing. It is absolutely clearly here we've got a print turned back into a sculpture. But my absolute favourite example is an extremely expensive teacup and saucer from the British Royal Collection, which has replicated Sadler's Augustus here and Sadler's Livia, his wife, there. And it won't escape your notice that as soon as you put Augustus on the saucer, you completely obliterated the woman, right? Now, those are taking us, I think, right to the heart of popular images of Roman emperors and Roman power as it was envisaged from the end of the 16th, the end of the 19th century. If we were living, say, in the middle of the 18th century, we shut our eyes and we tried to imagine a Roman emperor, this is what we would have seen. And their popularity only dwindled, I think, in the 20th century, when a more austere archaeological accuracy took over, plus perhaps a bit of a distaste for slightly Baroque prints. But I think there's a reason for bringing them back into popular renown. But I want to finish now with just two surprising tailpieces to the story. The story of the emperors, both of Titian and Sadler, one serious and one almost funny. What you may have spotted beneath the prints of Sadler that have been on the screen are, underneath each one, some lines of verse, which are a response to the figure above, summing up that particular emperor's achievements. And apart from those very enthusiastic claims about how lifelike Titian's figures were, these are the only early commentaries we have on the character of the figures depicted. Now, we do not know who in Sadler's workshop wrote them, and they are in truly appalling Latin, right? Dreadful, almost untranslatable. So, and perhaps that's letting art historians and historians off the hook, because most historians now who comment on the prints don't read the Latin. They say at most some lines of Latin verse underneath, right? Now, that's a pity, because the Latin is a real surprise. In most cases, the poems that accompany each image of this most famous series of images of emperors, in most cases, the poems are a direct attack on the emperor depicted above. There's only one who gets praise, and that is Vespasian, who came to power after the civil war, after Nero, where the poem starts in terrible Latin, "Look now on the image of a good Caesar for a change," it starts. The rest are horribly critical. Nero made a pile of evil, Domitian clouded the name of Caesar and stained its shrine, Julius Caesar, who's illustrated here, is accused of incest with his mother, and even the relatively good Titus is said to have been, quote, clever enough to take his pleasures secretly. Now, there is a really, really important point lurking here. It's always been easy to assume, in the absence of many contemporary responses, that Roman emperors used to decorate private homes, palaces, and public spaces to be seen as badges of authority, of success, and a positive symbol of power. And so I'm sure they sometimes were. I don't imagine that Federico Gonzaga constructed his room of the Caesars in order to undermine his own status. And as I've already said, there are issues of dynastic continuity there. But these scurrilous, nasty verses remind us that there's always something more to it with an image of the emperor. The fact that the most popular version of Titian's emperors that circulated across the West, the fact that they were accompanied by a devastating critique of all but one emperor, shows not only that a subversive reading of these images was possible, but more, I think, that they were always the subject of debate and disagreement. They were always used as ways of facing up to the question of what power was. How could you recognize the good and the bad, as perhaps the Memling portrait suggested? And there is, of course, a lesson for us now in that, I think. I think we should remember that when we discuss public images and public statues, maybe their function isn't simply to be admired, but also to prompt argument, debate, and disagreement. But to finish on a lighter note and back to the Alcázar fire, there were people in Britain who decades later did not believe that the Alcázar fire had ever actually happened. Or if it had happened, it had not destroyed Titian's emperors. In fact, it was a bit like the death of Elvis Presley, because there were all kinds of fantasies about their survival, about how, like Elvis, they hadn't really died, right? And in 1857, more than 100 years later, after the fire, 6 paintings that were said to be one half of Titian's originals were put on show in Manchester, in the UK. One of them is this guy, who we've already seen. And a completely ludicrous story was attached to them, that they'd actually gone to America, not to Spain, and then had been brought back totally safe. Now, these paintings were in fact cheap copies, and when this one turned up in auction in London a few years ago, it was sold very cheaply. Or very cheaply, you know, compared with what it would have been sold for if it had really been a Titian, right? And a few years earlier, in 1829, and in an entirely different story, the British press was eagerly reporting that 10 of the paintings, Titian's original Caesars, had actually turned up in a London shop. The newspaper articles were headlined, "An Extraordinary Instance of Good Fortune." And they claimed that, quotes, "A man who keeps a small shop in an obscure situation in London had bought the 10 paintings for £5 12 shillings, and when they were inspected by experts, had been judged to be, guess who, by Titian himself, and valued at £2,000. One report went on to claim that the shopkeeper had sold on his find to a, quote, "rich English nobleman whose name I have unfortunately forgotten," that's for the exorbitant sum of 8,000 quid. The whole story sounds very much like, to us, an urban myth. Note the kind of convenient amnesia about the buyer's name, whose name I have unfortunately forgotten. But what it does for me is it testifies to the fame of those forgotten images. And it would be, I have to say, you know, romantic as I am, it would be great if it were true. Sadly, it isn't. And sadly, they were not only destroyed in the fire here of 1734, but they were in a bit of a bad state, ruined thanks to Charles I and his agents on the way back to Mantua from London. But I think that they deserve to be remembered. And I think they deserve to be more in our consciousness about what an emperor could be made to look like than they are. And I think that I would like to think that one of the things I might do for them is to help us remember just how important a way of understanding, and really not understanding, but picturing Roman emperors these were. So I would say in my final bit of Spanish, merece la pena recordarlos. Gracias.